Welcome back to Oliver Scholar's CEO Salon series with your host, Dr. Danielle R. Moss. In this special edition, we'll discuss Black folks and the future of democracy. Help us welcome guest panelist, attorney Dinorah Getachu, and Professor Dr. Christina Greer. Get ready. Let's talk.
Hello, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to the CEO Salon series at Oliver Scholars. I'm really excited about our plethora of Black History Month programming, but I'm especially excited about today's conversation. So before I start to introduce our illustrious guests, I do want to acknowledge that one of our speakers was unable to join us, but we got a rain check from him, and so we look forward to having Kyle Anderson on the show at another time. So first, let me welcome Dinorah Getachu to the studio. Dinorah began her career as a legislative attorney at the New York City Council, advancing campaign financing, ethics, lobbying, and government reform. She most recently served as the New York Executive Director of Generation Citizen, an 11-year-old national nonprofit transforming how civics education is taught in secondary schools nationwide. Dinorah also led campaign issues at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School and directed policy for the public advocate, current Mayor de Blasio. So welcome, Dinorah. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. So excited for the conversation.
Our next guest is Dr. Christina Greer. Dr. Greer is an associate professor of political science and American studies at Fordham University. She is currently working on a manuscript that I'm already excited about. My heart is pounding, detailing the political contributions of Barbara Jordan, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Stacey Abrams. She recently co-edited Black Politics in Transition, which explores gentrification, suburbanization, and immigration of Blacks in America. And if she looks familiar, it's because she can frequently be seen on MSNBC, WNYC, and New York One, among many other media outlets. So welcome. How's everybody doing?
Better now that I'm with you two.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to jump right into it. We want to talk about, there's been so much attention on Black folks and democracy, and particularly last year for the 2020 election. What I want to know, is there a Black agenda in democracy, and what does that mean? Or what could it mean?
You jumping in there, Chrissy?
I mean, yeah, anybody can jump in.
I'll let you start, Dinorah, since I look to you for all things civics and understanding of policy. I think we are seeing, right, the crystallization of a Black agenda, right? I don't know that there is a manuscript or that it is written down as a formal agenda, but what we're seeing is that Black people realize that, as I like to say, democracy is a full contact sport, right? And unless they're going to be a part of the conversation of shaping and shepherding our democracy, they're going to be left behind, right? And so I think what's powerful about what we saw in the 2020 elections, and really the buildup, I think, even dating back to President Obama's election, is that Black people are actually realizing that they have a political voice and they're using it, not just in, recognizing that they should register to vote, but they're actually participating. And we're seeing the galvanization of both the marching in the streets turning into policies at the voting box. And I think for me, what's really inspiring about that means that we are really now seeing our democracy reach its full potential. Obviously, it's not responsive to us in the way that it can be, right? I think there's more work to be done. And I don't know that there is a singular agenda. So I hope that Black agenda, as it's being formed and shaped, is one that can be broad tent, if you will. But we're beginning to see that really take shape in a meaningful way. And to me, that's inspiring, right? Because it means that people understand that this complex political system is not just for the privileged and the wealthy, it's for all of us, right? And if we don't do our part to actually make sure we're participating and making our voices heard, then we're not going to be a part of making the change we want to see happen.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, when I think of a Black agenda, building off of what you just said, Dinorah, it's protest politics leads to electoral politics, and electoral politics has consequences, which leads to more protest politics. And I think we've seen the shapers of the Black agenda are largely Black women who are the canaries in the mine, not just for Black people, but for democracy as a whole, not just for small d democratic politics, but big D democratic politics as well. And so when we're thinking about the Black folks in all 50 states, when, you know, I write about sort of the racial and ethnic diversity among Black people, we have class diversity. Not all Black people are progressives, far from it. So most of our ideological diversity is trapped within one party. So especially on national elections, we've got 90% of Black people are voting for the Democratic Party, largely because Republicans have chosen to cast their lot in these past few generations with white nationalists. But that doesn't mean that we're progressive or even left-leaning. You know, we have very conservative Black people who are Democrats largely because they can't stomach voting for the Republican Party. We've got Black immigrants who are, you know, sort of in a party, in the Democratic Party, even though ideologically they probably fit more closely aligned with Republicans. So when we think about this agenda, I always say we've got a lot of shades of blue in this blue party that we're trying to figure out what works best for everyone's needs and wants. And it's this local, state, and national conversation, because what we might look forward to on a national level plays out a little differently in our local level politics. And I think we've seen Black women especially help shape that agenda, not just on the national level where we get immense credit, but we're also seeing it on local levels and state levels, especially since Republicans control most of the state houses. That's an incredibly large amount of money, and it's a lot of policy that directly affects Black people and Black families when it comes to the environment, when it comes to incarceration, when it comes to our children's education. All of these things we're seeing that we're the architects of walking and chewing gum at the same time, where we have to think about not just our needs, but the needs of the country as a whole, and sort of making strategic decisions in order to get what we need, but also recognizing how white people vote and how they think about us when they go to the voting booth.
So my next question was, how did the Black vote become such a power block in national politics? But I also want to piggyback off of something you mentioned around the role of Black women. So how have Black people at large become this power block in terms of deciding national politics, but how did Black women emerge in this role in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start, Dinorah. I mean, you know, we saw Black women as active participants in the electoral process well before they were even allowed to properly vote. So we know that the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. We know that, you know, in 1920, white women got the right to vote, but it wasn't really until 1965 that Black women, the passage of the Voting Rights Act under LBJ, what he signed, really gave Black women the full franchise. And so as we see this party realignment, so Blacks moving from the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, and sort of calcifying themselves as the Democratic Party in the 1960s, with sort of Kennedy, and then with LBJ, we see the power of the Black vote because, you know, we're slowly but surely starting to be able to join unions. On a local level, people are seeing that, okay, Black people are now concentrated in cities because we've had the great migration from the South, and now we're in Detroit and St. Louis and Chicago and Pittsburgh. We've gone out to the West, to LA, and to, you know, parts of sort of small cities in the Midwest as well. And people are recognizing that, you know, we are a political force because we tend to vote as a block, because we have to think about our interests. We very rarely vote as individuals. We are one of the few groups that votes as a community. We actually think about what will this election do for the community. There's this idea called linked fate that we have in political science, where Black people vote thinking about other Black people, and no other racial and ethnic groups really participate that way. So as we're moving forward into this national politics conversation, Black women slowly but surely getting the right to vote, but they were doing other things, as Dinorah mentioned before. We were protesting, we were sort of organizing before we even had the full franchise. You know, we were helping to raise money for social activists to do voter registration efforts. We were being beaten and raped as well to try and help register people to vote. So fast forward to the 21st century, you have Black women who have a keen fundamental understanding of the necessity of what kind of leadership can move forward, not just our communities, but the democracy as a whole. So we have a 360-degree view of what education looks like. We have a 360-degree view of what jobs look like, or the environment. So there's no such thing as a woman's issue. Every issue affects sort of Black communities in this very robust way. And it seems to be Black women who are the ones who understand what all these policies mean to be a woman, to be a Black person, to be a Black woman, and to look out for one's community and for one's country in a much larger way than no other group or no other demographic tends to do.
I couldn't agree more. And I think what's powerful about that, though, is like this notion that, right, when Black women go to vote, we're not just saying, as Dr. Greer said, Dr. Greer, we're going with Dr. Greer or Chrissy? Where are we going?
We're going with Chrissy.
We don't just vote ourselves, right? Like, even in my own house, I'm like, are we all registered to vote? Are we all going to vote? What's the time? Like, we bring, as we say in Higher Heights, we bring our church, our block, our sorority, we bring everybody to vote. And I think that's what's been so powerful, right? You look, I got this sweater on that says Solidarity Sister, but when there was all of this movement around the 19th Amendment, that wasn't a movement that they wanted Black women to be a part of, right? They, in fact, weren't even allowing us to be a part of the front-facing component of that. But the reality was we were the ones who were pushing that rock up the hill just as much as everyone else. And now, in hindsight, history is giving us credit for that. But the reality is we understand the promise of democracy, I think, unlike many other groups, and realize that we've got to lean into it to make it what we hope it can be for ourselves and our communities. I have a son who's a young adult. And I remember the day after the insurrection, he said to me, well, how are you feeling? And I said, I feel disappointed. And he goes, well, why do you feel disappointed? If you're disappointed, that means that you have hope. And I said, I have to have hope in democracy and that it can actually transform lives, because if not, then we've got nothing left, right? And so I think that's what, to me, embodies what it means to be a Black woman in America, thinking about the leverage that you have when you think about democracy. It's like, we've got to be leaning in on it. Otherwise, we're never going to get this underlying substantive change on the issues we care about, because we can't get to that, right? Democracy often feels like this luxury item that we're going to invest in, we're going to pay for, we're going to demystify later. I start from the premise that if we don't understand how democracy works, right? If you're not in a historically marginalized community, an underrepresented community, telling people day by day how it works, they're never going to be able to understand how to connect that to the outcomes they want on the policy issues. And Black women are there time and time again, making sure that people understand democracy, but also making sure that the democracy is responding to us and leveraging our political voice, our spending power, and our place in society to be able to make it a more responsive and engaging representation for us.
So you made some reference to the fact that the vote is relatively new for us, actually. I wasn't alive exactly in '65. But I was around shortly thereafter, right? So this isn't my mother's generation. We are only one generation into actually having, the right to vote. Can you explain what happened in 2013 to spur increased voter suppression tactics? Was it legal? Is it reversible? How do we get our stuff back, basically?
I think.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think, what happened in 2013 is what happens every time Black people, any marginalized group, any minority is coming of power in America, right? You can see it time and time again in history. When new majorities come of age, if you will, in America, states and the federal government decide to change the rules, right, to make it harder for those people to participate. The same thing that happened in 2013 after we saw record participation after the 2008 and the 2012 elections, right? At that time, Black turnout rates were 64% and 66% high in those elections, the highest since the 1968 elections, right? Black people were showing up and participating in record numbers. We see that then states were like, well, let's make it harder to, for those people to participate. Let's put barriers in the way, be it voter ID laws, because we know very often that marginalized communities don't have access to the documentation necessary or the resources necessary to get government issued ID. Let's restrict access to registering to vote, so make the deadline really much longer before the elections. Because when you think about how elections work, it's in that crucial 10 days to 2 weeks before the election when everybody's tuned in. In many states, it's too late to register to vote by then. So you're going to be counted out then. You're putting more and more barriers into place. Talk about returning citizens, those who paid their debt to society. Many states still make it hard for them to, once they come out of prison, to actually participate in voting. And so it's not by accident. It's an intentional reaction to people participating and making their voices heard. And the same thing is happening now, right? Last year, in 2020, was the highest turnout election we had in over a century. And now we've got 33 states trying to make it harder to vote again. Like, it's not by accident that this is happening. They're looking at the same data we see. They're looking at the power of the Stacey Abrams of the world who are organizing political power, and they're thinking, how do we limit that power?
Right. I mean, it's no surprise. It's not a shock. this country has always ebbed and flowed when it comes to inclusion of people of color in the democratic process. And so, we haven't been voting under the full protection of the Voting Rights Act since 2013. And so that's by design. We know that state houses are sort of hell-bent on making sure that they don't see a repeat of 2020. Because Republicans know the way that, without the Electoral College, there's no chance for them on the executive level. They know that they must maintain control of state houses because, we've got to draw these census lines. A state like New York is probably going to lose 2 seats. And we know that that shouldn't be the case. But then again, also New York is one of the bottom tier states, making it easy for people to actually participate in their own democracy, right? If you want to participate in New York's elections, you should have thought about that 4 months ahead of time, when very few people, except for people like me, politicos and journalists, are thinking about races. And so I think, we also have to be honest too about, the face of voter suppression on the national level is definitely the Republican Party, for sure. They have gone through great lengths to make sure that Black people specifically and explicitly cannot participate in the democratic process, small d democratic process. But when we look at state levels, we also have to be honest about there are a lot of Democratic, big D Democratic elected officials who want to make sure that there aren't new people who are introduced into the electoral sphere because they have their base. They understand that their primary is basically their election. So they don't want no new friends. They don't want young people. They don't want new people of color. They don't want anyone in there who they don't know, because that messes up their gravy train. And so if we're going to have a robust conversation about voter suppression, there's definitely the Republican Party who is at fault on the national level. But when we're thinking about local level and state level decision making in a place like New York, we also have to look at those individuals who have been in office indefinitely and do not want young people, because they're getting elected to Albany sometimes with 3,000-4,000 votes in a random primary in June, and then here we are, right? And so they're in charge of however many thousands of people within their district, but people aren't paying attention to what's going on in Albany. And we know that they're in charge of billions of dollars, to say nothing of the policies that they can sign into legislation or vote into legislation or not, that directly affect our lives, like directly affect us in ways that the federal government doesn't even touch us.
No, that's absolutely right. Just to build on that point though, and it's also fascinating to me because what ends up happening is people, they understand the rules right up until it's time to register to vote. They elect, I like to say they coronate their leaders and then they go off into the sunset. So it's not even like they're holding them accountable to say, don't change the rules or make the rules more accessible so that more people can participate, or on the substance, as you said, Chrissy, these are the issues that matter to me and this is why I voted for you, now go do something, right? It's often like they wish them adieu and they're like, tell me the next time you need my vote and I'll come back and I'll decide how I feel. It's like, we're doing ourselves such a huge disservice, and that's why these states are doing it, because they know nobody's paying attention. The minute the election is over, right? I remember once standing in a poll site on the Air Force side, and we were standing in line. It was a reasonable line, a 10-minute line. I'm like, yeah, we can stand in line to vote. My husband's like, this is a problem. People need to do something about this. And I literally turned around to him in this poll site and I said, hi, I'm your wife. I advocate to get rid of structural barriers to participation. And he's like, oh, right. But no one cares, right? The minute after he left that poll site, he wasn't going to keep talking about that. He wasn't going to call a private official. He wasn't going to do anything. And that's what happens. It's we get desensitized to actually investing in democracy.
Well, I think also, I agree 1,000%. And I think, it's on both parties, right? Because we know elected officials aren't going to say, hey, knock, knock, Dinorah, you haven't checked in on me in 2 years. Are you making sure I'm doing my job right? Because if not, you do know it's in your power to make me unemployed very quickly, right? So they're just sort of like, hey, if I'm out of sight, out of mind, you don't know my name, you're just party line voting, you have no idea what I'm voting for or not. And so that's part of our responsibility. I always tell my students, I'm like, 5 minutes less of the Real Housewives of Nowheresville and 5 minutes on the interwebs trying to figure out who your state legislator is and who your state senator is, right? And I think that's what's really important, for us to hold them accountable and say, hey, I'm actually paying attention, not just on election day, not just the 6 weeks leading up to the election when you're showing me all your good report cards, but I'm actually watching you and watching what you and your colleagues are doing to make sure that I'm getting the democracy that I deserve.
Right.
So what's the pathway to kind of undoing the damage of 2013, particularly since it involves the Supreme Court? Are they the all-powerful whiz? Can we reverse this? can we re-engage in some way to make sure that we can thwart some of these efforts at the local and state level?
Well, I mean, I think, this is a lot of the voting rights legislation that's currently making its way through Congress is important. I think that, we also have to remove, as Dinorah mentioned, these structural barriers that are state specific, right? Let's be clear. Fair fight was in 20 states, and those 20 states, by and large, delivered for the Democrats. Every single Republican in those states is well aware of that as well, and they will be making sure that, in Texas, you can use your own ID, but not your school ID, right? We know that the elderly tend not to have IDs. We know that, and they've sort of imprisoned Black women who have accidentally voted on parole. That's not an accident. That's an intimidation tactic for poor people, for our returning citizens, for people who don't fully understand the electoral process. If you're just like, listen, I got a lot going on, I have a job, I've just returned back into my community, and then you see a national story about a Black woman who accidentally voted and she's now back in prison for 5 years, why would you go out of your way to do that?
Right.
You would just, like, forget it. It's too much. And you get disinformation being told to you, thank you, Mark Zuckerberg, that your vote doesn't count anyway. So why would you risk your livelihood just to put yourself and your family and your community in danger to do that? So we're being targeted in a lot of different ways, with not just disinformation, not just with structural and institutional barriers, not just with parties making sure that, we don't participate if we haven't been highly participatory because they're not even asking us for their vote or reporting back to us about what they've been doing. And so we need to make sure that, each one teach one. And we've seen this with Black women, in their social organizations and their sororities and their churches, making sure it's like, it's not enough for you to go to the polls. It's now not enough for you and your family and your friend group to go to the polls. Who else have you gotten to the polls who wasn't thinking about going to the polls? That's how you get a Georgia. But the difference is you don't get a Georgia overnight. That's over a decade of hard work from Stacey Abrams. So guess what? We're the other Stacey Abrams. Beto loses his race. He goes on a drive looking in the rearview mirror talking about what was me. Jamie Harrison loses his race. He doesn't stay in South Carolina to try and work on structural barriers to participation for Black South Carolinians. He goes off to the DNC. Hey, more power to you. I can't tell you what job to have or not to have, but we see these men who run for office who say that they want to change the structural barriers within their state. And when it doesn't happen, Stacey Abrams was robbed, and I will go to my grave saying that, right? But when it doesn't happen for them, for whatever reason, they pack it up and it's like, well, I'm just going to run for the next highest office. Okay. And it's like, so Stacey Abrams got robbed and for 2 years worked tirelessly for a state that didn't deliver for her, that did deliver, but it stole it from her, but still was like, you know what? I'm going to give you 2020 and I'm going to give you 2 senators. And I'm going to literally work day and night to make sure Georgia turns blue, because my philosophy was always telling you all we were purple, trending blue. So we don't have enough people who are dedicated to the long struggle of the wins and the losses, because a lot of the losses we see, especially this is a gender conversation, but with the men, they're like, okay, well, I lost. Now let's run for something higher than the thing I lost for. I'm looking at you, Pete Buttigieg, in charge of transportation, aka 47 buses in the state of South Bend, Indiana. So it's like, how are you, you lose running for the president and now you're a cabinet member. Good for you. But, Polly Trottenberg works for you and she was in charge of how many in New York City? So, I think we have to ask ourselves, who are the people who are actually in charge of making these decisions, and are they in it for the long run?
Well, and so I think that's right. Part of it is like, yes, these changes are being implemented at the state level and there's more work to be done to fix it, right, and get rid of those barriers. But as it relates to the Voting Rights Act, right, one of the things that we know is the Supreme Court said you need to bring back evidence, right? You need to actually bring back evidence that articulates a rationale for why you need these restrictions in place. The amazing thing is, and you said this earlier, Chrissy, they knew, right? Without the Voting Rights Act, they could go crazy. They could implement so many changes at the state level, for the Republicans in particular, to make it harder to vote. And now there's no cop on the beat, right? But in order to actually get the cop back on the beat, it's not as simple as Congress passing a bill. Congress actually needs, the Supreme Court said in Shelby v. Holder, you need to bring back evidence that this is still necessary. So part of what needs to happen is that Congress has to do its due diligence, right? They actually need to hold the hearings. They need to use the census data. They need to actually demonstrate the case for what's been happening in these states. What have the restrictions done? How has it made it harder for people to vote? and then take that and use that evidence to be able to bring back a revived Voting Rights Act, if for no other reason, to honor the legacy of John Lewis, right, who lived and died to make sure that all of us can sit here today and have this conversation about voting in America as Black people.
Right. But too many people like to talk about John Lewis without respecting John Lewis.
I'm not one of those people.
No. But I mean, you know what I'm saying? But too many people in Congress like to sort of talk about the legacy of John Lewis. It's like, well, then respect the legacy of John Lewis and actually get to work and pass this legislation. And I think, Joe Biden and a lot of the Democrats don't understand. You all have 2 years. Right. Because if you all do not maintain this slim margin in the Senate or the House, because don't forget, Democrats lost seats in 2020. So if you don't have unified government, you get nothing done. And it's been very clear, abundantly clear, that Republicans are just like, I don't care what your policy is. The answer is no. I don't care if it's a policy that I suggested. The answer is no. You get no wins, right? And so Democrats spend all this time like, well, let's try and compromise and negotiate and like figure things out. It's like, Mitch McConnell doesn't do that. No Republicans believe in that philosophy. You got a limited amount of time and a lot of work on your plate. We need to just do it. Apologize later, right? So don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness.
Right, but this is also about power, to your point, right? Like Mitch McConnell, he understands power and he understands numbers. They know the changing demographics of America are not in their favor. And so if they don't lock it in the short term, one, with the redistricting that's going to happen, and two, with some of the laws that make it harder for people to vote, they're going to lose generation after generation. So they've got their last hurrah. They have their clear marching orders, and they're willing to go to the mat to get the wins they need to survive, right? Like this is, again, about the survival of their party. It's not about what's in the best interest of democracy. We saw that on January 6th. That wasn't the best interest of democracy.
I would argue that it's the survival of their party and also the survival of whiteness, because that's at the root of the power conversation. And they're more than happy to calcify certain policies on the books because they're fine with an apartheid system where they are the minority. We've seen this time and time again with the Senate. They're the minority opinion of what the vast majority of Americans want when it comes to democracy, but they're just going to push through their agenda anyway. And that's the crux of what Democrats don't understand. They don't understand power. They don't understand offense. Even when they should be playing offense, they're like, hey, you want the ball? It's like, that's not how it works because Mitch McConnell will never give you an inch. And so if we're saying that we're fighting for the right causes, we're on the right side of justice. We are fighting for Voting Rights Act and so many other acts for equality and equity and inclusion and belonging, whatever it may be. The list goes on and it's long. We don't have time. And so as Dinorah says, they understand power and they understand numbers. One of the main numbers they understand is this. They're just like, you know what? If we make the Democrats run out the clock, then once people start campaigning, they're going to have limited things to say because, they're going to be campaigning. And then 2022, let's just hope the pendulum swings the way it always has, sort of gives us what we need.
That's right.
So how do we mobilize ourselves and hold the administration accountable? What does accountability look like? I always feel like, is that marching? Is that policy wonks kind of showing up? What does it look like? Now we know that we're on this clock. How can we make sure that it's almost like sometimes they're not playing the game that's being played, if that makes any sense. Yes. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like you came to a football field in ballet slippers.
I always say Democrats come to a knife fight with a whole bunch of emails. It's like we can give people paper cuts because that's pretty much all you can do. I mean, I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach. I think that we have to we need to stay in the streets because for some electeds, that's the only way that they'll respond, right? And sort of seeing Black people marching clearly upsets folks, not seeing white men with swastikas and Confederate flags, but seeing Black people peacefully protesting does do something to folks and it does change policy. I think that, on a policy level, on a think tank level, we need to be giving them ideas. Because keep in mind, we are so far off from where our democracy should be. Those past 4 years were traumatic for us as individuals, but as we're sifting through the books, there are minor things that administration did that we're still just finding, environmental policy or sort of some obscure housing policy or just defunding an agency or just letting an agency kind of die on the vine as bureaucrats retired and not really staffing them. So we're still trying to figure out the puzzle that was the last 4 years, but it has to be a multi-pronged approach. And it has to be like, yes, Joe Biden, your heart's in it, but now we have to make sure you don't get us just kind of to where we were. We actually do need some advancement. Like nobody's looking for Obama 2.0 in 2021. Like Obama left office in 2016. Like we don't need that. We actually need something that speaks to this time. And so, we might have to call out some Democrats. I think what makes it complicated is that there's no such thing as a Democrat, right? I mean, we are so diverse when it comes to our issues and our interests. I always tell people, I'm like, sometimes a New York City Republican is more liberal than a Dallas Democrat, depending on the issue. So we have to sort of understand that we are a big tent. We have not chosen to cast our lot with white nationalists. We actually do welcome immigrants. We actually do welcome people of color. We actually do welcome the LGBTQ plus communities. But those aren't easy decisions to make when we're thinking about it on a policy level, because there is wide diversity there, but we can't let up. And I think this goes back to Dinorah's earlier point. It's like, just because we voted in November, you can't pat yourself on the back, do your little victory lap for the next 4 years. Like, I helped, get rid of Trump and I voted for Biden. And, right, if you don't hold them accountable, guess what? Trump 2.0, the smarter version, will be in office in 2024. I guarantee it, right? Because they're already recognizing the saving grace for us is that we had, just an ignoramus who wasn't interested in legislation. So we did everything by executive order by and large. Can you imagine if he actually used the unified government that he had for 2 years and put these things on the books, which he could have? He's just too lazy. Thank God, right? He was too lazy to do a lot of the things that he could have done. But we need to sort of stay vigilant. And I think that that's just not an endurance run that most Americans are used to. And quite honestly, they're exhausted from the last 4 years because most Americans haven't paid attention to politics the way that they did the last 4 years. Who could tell you cabinet members before? Who could tell you nitty gritty elements of policy before Trump came into office? And I think that is the one silver lining. I mean, the women on this call, but I think the one silver lining is that the last 4 years have introduced us to civics in a way and the levels of government in a way that most Americans had been completely unaware.
So that's where I want to go, right? Like, I wouldn't be here having this conversation if we're not going to talk about civics, right? Because I think it's the practice of democracy doesn't just happen when you turn 18, right? Like, democracy is a complex political system, right? Dr. Greer, I'm going to call you Dr. Greer in this instance because she studies it all day, right? And she's unpacking it at the macro level and the micro level. You don't just wake up and understand how democracy works. And it's not by design. I mean, it is by design that we're not being taught how it works, right? Like, for several generations, since the 60s, we've de-emphasized educating people about how to participate in this complex political sport. Well, if we don't teach them, how are you supposed to know what you're supposed to do when it's time to vote, right? So on the one hand, I'm going to say unequivocally, we need more people to be educated at all age levels about how democracy works in all communities, right? Not just in urban communities. We need to go to rural communities where people don't understand how democracy works and why they're voting against their interests time and time again. We actually need people to understand democracy. We've got to demystify it. And that civics is one way to do it. I think we need some civics for adults too. We need more people to just actually understand. If you want me to sing Schoolhouse Rock and how a bill becomes a law, that's part of it. But then what's the skill development? What's the civic agency we all have that we need to exercise? And unequivocally, marching in the streets is one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is taking up policy and getting it passed. What we keep forgetting is we're only using some of the tools in the toolbox, right? So that's why we're not winning. We're using like the ones who, they're scared of us marching the streets, let's go protest again. No, every person out there that's protesting, I want you to tell me, when is your next election? Get registered to vote. And then what are you going to advocate for? So you want Black Lives to Matter? What does that agenda mean? At the ballot box? And then after that, right, call your elected official and advocate for policies. Make sure you're building that coalition of people and keeping them engaged. I think we get too caught up in like, I'm tired now. It's like, well, we all have to be resilient. Otherwise, we're not going to get any of this across the field. And that's what they're counting on. Is like that we're going to be too lazy to figure out the rules. We're going to be slacktivists. So we're going to keep thinking we're tweeting our way to a solution as opposed to really thinking about the comprehensive and systemic change we need on issues. And that we're not going to leverage all the tools we've got to actually get anything done. So talk about being on the clock. It's not 2 years. It's probably like 18 months, right? Because by next summer or summer of 22, they're going to be like, we got to start thinking about the next election, right? Summer of this year even. They're going to start talking about that. He hasn't gotten anything done yet. What do you do in the first 100 days? And they're going to be trashing them on that. So it's like, you all have to connect the dots. Like, let's take a power nap and then get back in the game and make sure we're participating.
I mean, the more you talk, the more terrified I am. In 2016, after that election, I can remember I never went to sleep. Like, I literally just was up the entire night in stunned disbelief. And so I thought I was going to have this real immense wave of relief in 2020 when Joe and Kamala won. And I was like, post-traumatic stress disorder, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, of course, it did drop on January 6th. You've mentioned social media, the potential for misinformation. How can people educate themselves on the issues that are relevant to their lives so that they can use this power of the vote responsibly?
I think it's some many factors, right? I think it's not just sitting in the bubble that is Facebook, Twitter, all the social media, right? That is a tool in the toolbox, but it's not the singular tool, right? And I think for most voters, that's where they're getting their information from. They're not reading local newspapers. They're not going to primary source materials. They're just literally, they're creating these social media bubbles, right? Where it's like, if you don't drink the same Kool-Aid that I have on tap at home, you're out, right? And I think that's what's happened, is that we've gotten to such a polarized place in society where people don't understand how to disagree and be disagreeable when they're doing it, right? If you think back for a minute to the founding of America, the founders didn't all have the same beliefs. Granted, they were all white men, but they had very divergent views about even what it was going to take to form this country. But they stuck at it, and they kept thinking about how to get to compromise in some sense of like, how do you build a constitution that can sustain the test of time? By actually having a debate and having a respectful and a forceful, but a fact-based debate. We don't do that anymore, right? It's like my version of facts versus yours. Like, we spent the last 4 years debating facts. Like, knowable, concrete, provable facts were in question. One, I think to Chrissy's point, we've got to actually undo that, right? And it's going to take some time to actually rebuild trust in government and understand how to, articulate what is progress, what are the right policies. But on some level, it's incumbent upon us as Americans, as voters, as citizens, and I mean that in the global sense of citizens, to do our part, to actually try to learn, try to go deeper on issues, and not just think like, oh, the clickbait is what I'm supposed to know and learn, and then move on. All of our lives are busy, right? So we're going to stipulate that, right? On some level, I think the pandemic, the silver lining for me has been that it's all been shredded, right? We're all back at square one together. And then what does it take to actually rebuild? Now that we've seen the inequities, we've seen the disparities, no one can hide from that anymore, right? Like, we can all stipulate that we live in an unequal society with vast disparities in access to wealth, healthcare, food, etc. Then what, right? Like, don't just complain about it, don't just tweet about it. Now it's incumbent on all of us, if we want to rebuild this and into some better version, right? If you want to transform it, whatever the word is we all want to use, then you actually have to do the education yourself about where do your elected officials stand on the issues, what issues are important to you, and then actually take the step of doing something and not just complaining about it. And I think that's where Americans have, we got complacent, we got tired, and we actually got beaten down, right? So we were, even for those of us who had the stamina, we didn't have the capacity to keep fighting on every front. Now is our chance, I think, to be more intentional and strategic, dig in deeper in our communities, understand it's not just at the federal level where all the change is going to happen. So think about your state and local politics. Is it really affecting your day-to-day life? Read your local newspaper. Look in New York One when Chrissy's on, informing and educating you there. And then think about what you're going to do with that education and knowledge, as opposed to just like, well, I'm going to watch this Facebook, read this fake news that we've all, has been debunked already. Like, I think that's the problem, is that we just get caught up in our silos and we're lazy.
Yeah, I think the key is we have to do the work. Like, it's not easy, and it's not going to be handed to us on a silver platter. And, there are things that we need to still fight and debate that will help move forward this democracy. But then also, you got to protect your peace. There's certain things that aren't up for debate. So it's like, I'm not doing panels anymore where it's like, should Blacks have the right to vote? I'm not doing that. We're not actually debating that. That's not a real conversation for me, right? It's like, because there are a lot of people who make a living sort of based on incendiary comments. But I think, in the education process for all of us, and it does take work. So it's like, we're all busy, but we're not that busy. Like, figure out a time to invest in yourself so you can invest in your democracy. But I remember hearing Al Sharpton say this when he was talking about social justice organizations and how they're so different, but how do they work together? And as someone who's a birder, it resonated with me, because he essentially said, we've all seen geese fly in that triangular formation. And that first goose that's flying takes all of the headwind. And so the geese that are behind him in that triangular formation, I mean, they're flying, but they're literally just coasting on the hard work of the first goose, and they're just kind of catching the current. And so that first goose takes it for as long as they can, and then they go around the back and someone else takes the lead. And so we also have to remember that this is an endurance run. This isn't something, as Dinorah and I keep saying, it's not something that you do every November, once every 2 years. this is something that is sustained. So you also have to recognize you can't do it all the time. And so figuring out your strategy. It's like, well, I want to focus on local politics and education. I want to focus on the environment and sort of making sure we have national environmental policy. I want to focus on Albany and what's going on there with marijuana legalization or prisons or whatever, nursing homes, whatever it may be, and recognizing that we have to do the work, but we also have to rest, because our ancestors have taught us, if we're listening, it's like, yes, we must do the work to get the results, but they also always told us that if we do not rest, we cannot do the work. And we've seen time and time again, people who burn themselves out thinking that it's only about the work, and then you're of no use to anyone. So I think that we also have to sort of use our connections so that we lighten the load for other people who are doing this work. Because we've seen the burnout, and then it sets the movement back. It sets the progress back as well. So we have to be very clear about what we have the capacity to do, and also share the burden with other people and ask them to step up. And then I think the last piece is, Dinorah, when you're talking about the framers, obviously I think about them often and I have lots of complicated feelings about them. But the three branches of government, obviously, legislative, executive, judicial, I list them as such because that's how they're listed in the Constitution. But the fourth invisible branch is the media. And we know that the media dropped the ball. They dropped the ball before the 2016 election and by and large dropped the ball during the 4 years of the Trump administration. And we see that they're sort of about to do it again, focusing on the wrong things, the wrong people, the wrong questions. We also look at the homogeneity of many people in media and who own media and sort of what they're interested in. And so oftentimes the stories that matter to us, the angles of the stories that matter to us aren't front and center. And so we also have to learn how to read newspapers so that when we're looking at primary sources, we recognize that some of those primary sources are actually incorrect, right? And sort of your gut knows it's like, this story doesn't sound right. And so then do a little bit more digging, right? And if you can, support local media so that we don't just have conglomerates and big national papers. It's like, you know what? Ethnic media often tells you what's really going down, right? And they're the ones who need our resources and they need us to be paying attention the most. Smaller newspapers who have people who are really sort of in the nitty gritty of the politics, in communities, in neighborhoods that are telling us things oftentimes well before national stories pick it up. We need to be supporting those media efforts as well, because that's actually where we'll really understand a holistic picture of what's going on in our democracy or not going on.
Can we unpack a little bit? You said that you felt the media dropped the ball. We just had a conversation with some journalists around what the role of the media has been in democracy and can be in terms of democracy. Can you unpack that comment a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they focused on like, oh, wow, Trump is like, look at what he did over here. Look at what he did there. And it's like, it was basically, I always called him the toddler that dropped the Cheerios on the ground to see how quickly the media would pick it up, right? And so if you've ever sort of given a toddler Cheerios, they just keep throwing them. See, it's like, okay, monkey, will you keep doing it? Instead of just saying, what exactly is this man doing to our democracy? Let's actually look at a bigger picture. Or let's look at what some of these other people are doing or not doing. Why does everything have to be the Trump show? And it was for 4 years. And it's very distracting because in any given day, we could have 8 major burning news stories and none of them were followed up on. And that was sort of the strategy. And he told us that was the strategy. And we sort of went along with it for 4 years. And so instead of like focusing on, okay, no, let's actually stick with this story really quickly and see how it actually plays out, right? But by and large, loads of stories just disappeared. We stopped talking about Charlottesville about a week after Charlottesville. This man said that there were good people on both sides. We just dropped it. The president of the United States said that a man with swastikas and Confederate flags beating Black people with flagpoles, killing a white woman as he drove from Ohio to Virginia to do that very deed. He was like, oh, they're both good people and bad people on both sides, good people on both sides. It's like, oh, well, that's just what it is, right? When he came down that gold-plated escalator and said Mexicans are rapists, you didn't want to follow up. You just wanted to let him roll into office because he was good for ratings and he sold your papers. So like time and time again, this man showed us who he was. He told us who he was. The FBI is like, we didn't know about January 6th. I knew about January 6th. You know why? Because my Twitter feed said, hey, everybody, come to DC on January 6th. It's going to be wild! Exclamation point, exclamation point. So, I mean, I think the the undergirding conversation is, and this is, some people agree, some people don't, but it's a fact as far as I'm concerned. White people don't understand white people. Going back to your very original question, Black people, Black women especially, understand the capacity of white people at the voting booth and also in society. And we have to sort of vote and behave accordingly. White people don't understand, like when the Oath Keepers say, like, we will kill the vice president, we brought a guillotine. They don't believe that it'll happen. Black people know it'll happen. We believe you when you say that. We've seen it. We know that it is in your capacity to do that, to hold power, to hold white supremacy, to make sure that this is your country. So until white people, good-meaning liberals who sort of voted for Obama twice, would vote for him a third time if they could, until they fully understand the depths to which other white people will go to maintain what they view as their country, we actually can't really move forward. We will be having these circular debates because this is a very real threat. It's not an existential threat. It's not a philosophical threat about the future of America. It is a physical threat. And so that is the problem with the real, we're having these surface conversations. It's like, at the end of the day, guess what? White people will kill a whole bunch of Black people and white people to maintain power. And white people don't fully believe that that would be the case. It's like, well, you killed a police officer with your Blue Lives Matter flag, so actually believe it, right? You've been more than happy to kill other white people who stand on the side of justice with Black people, so believe that. Mike Pence, you didn't think that they'd turn on you that quickly, but your own partner said to do it. So I think that's these conversations, as Dinorah said, it's like you can't sort of turn a blind eye and be like, I don't really know what's going on. Some people still can sort of hide behind that. And there's nothing we can do about those folks. I mean, that's when their family members have to sort of work on them, because they're obviously not going to listen to 3 smart Black girls to change their minds if all of these things that you've seen hasn't done that thus far. But I do think that, like, we have to be vigilant in all senses of the word, at the ballot booth, in protest, in policy, in working on people who can be, reasoned with. But also the crux of it is we have to guard our peace. There are going to be certain people that they are immovable when it comes to this conversation, and recognize that's not our duty to change their minds. We can put that on their friend group, their family members to do that. But like, this is, it's also a global pandemic. So, I mean, we have to make sure that we're relatively sane in doing this work, because it's a long-term endeavor. It's not just something that'll be done by 2022.
What do you think the role of grassroots organizing has been in helping to shape Black politics in the U.S.? And are we still using that as a strategy? I feel like the NAACP of Rosa Parks was a grassroots organizing organization. And sometimes it feels like as organizations grow and expand their reach, those good old-fashioned tactics become more a part of their distant past. But what has been the role of organizing at the grassroots level?
I think those tactics are still applicable, right? I think it's just a new guard, a new generation, if you will, of grassroots organizers who are using those same tactics and refining them and perfecting them in a modern era, right? And leveraging the technology, the assets we have at our disposal right now. And the NAACP and other, historic organizations are still doing that work, just in a very different way. I think the challenge is often people, the comment you made earlier, Chrissy, of like this rolling blue, right? Like, it's not one monolithic voice that everybody's speaking with. So people think that there's a disconnect in the movement. No, there's multiple roles that people can play. And I think what's more important is that there's a strategy that is being laid over all of this. I'm not privy to what that strategy is. I think where the opportunity exists for us as Black people in particular is to be more strategic and more aligned about how we're moving the progress forward. I think there's also a real conversation that needs to happen about how transformative, how systemic change actually occurs. It's not just the click and the retweet, right? That is a tactic, right? But when you think about transformative change, it's all of the tools being used, right? So you're using the media, right? You've got a strategic communications plan. You've got the bill you're pushing up at Congress or at the State House or at the City Council. You're making sure that you've got the right allies who are pushing from the inside, right? As well as from the outside of government to make that happen. I think the challenge is, it's not that those grassroots organizers don't exist, it's that we're all in silos. And in many instances, we're negotiating against ourselves for the small little piece of the pie we're going to get, as opposed to saying, look, this is what we could get. Here's the big victory. And if we all could align, we could get to that big victory by using the multifaceted strategy to get there. So I would say the media is a big piece of that, to the former question you raised. And then we just have to be strategic about pushing the media to cover the issues in the right way, to actually make sure that we have a voice in those dialogues, and it's not this monolithic, homogenous group of reporters reporting the same story that isn't really the story. And then we're actually leveraging that towards the grassroots as well as grass tops aim we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to see kind of like how this whole thing unfolds, because I definitely felt like some careers were made in the media over the last 4 years, where there was like this hammering of, the chaos. And like, as we shift away from that chaos, it'll be interesting to see, what rises to the level of news and how that's handled. So I have 1 or 2 questions left.
Us though, just to jump in quickly, isn't that our responsibility to push the media to actually do better, right? So if we don't like the chaos theory approach to news coverage, if we don't think that the journalism is heavy hitting, responsive, and high punching, then why are we pushing for them to do better, right? I think part of it is on us that we're like, oh, well, I'll just tune out, right? Again, 100% agree with the self-care point of that Chrissy made, but we still have to do our part to hold them accountable too, right? So to say, that's not real journalism. You didn't actually cover that story. Or flip side, Joe Biden has been here for 2 days and you're beating the man up like he did all the sins of the last 4 years. That's actually not real journalism either. And so I think part of it has to be on us to push for the media that we want to cover the issues that are important to us in our community. Because all of this, at the end of the day, is about ratings and money, right? It's not about the news per se, right? So let's be honest. The same thing can happen for the next 4 years, because at the end of the day, it's about the money and the ratings that they want to see driving the clicking on their website or the clicks on the TV to the extent you still have one. And if we're not saying to them, that's not real news coverage, or that's not what you should be covering that's relevant to my community, they're going to keep doing the same thing.
Since we are a youth serving organization, what would you both say to our young people about what they can do to save democracy? I always thought that democracy, like, we live in a democracy. And I think what I've learned in recent years is that democracy is fragile. Like, people can find ways to take this away from us, as imperfect as we know it has been for people who look like us. So, we have some amazing young people who are thinking about like how they're going to create a world that they want to live in. So what does that look like? What would you say to our young people?
Well, I always encourage young people to think about running for office. And remember that democracy, and this is how we got ourselves into this bit of a bind in the past, but it's not something that, we attain, we put in a frame, put it on the wall and sort of admire it like, wow, this is nice. Just like dust it every few weeks. It's something that is a series of daily choices and decisions on individual and group levels. And we've seen what happens when we sort of take it for granted, as Dinorah has mentioned, and just say like, oh, that's something we achieved. It's like, absolutely not. It is a living, breathing thing that we must attend to like a plant on a daily basis. And so I would encourage young people to think about where they see themselves in this democracy. For some, I encourage people to run for office. Like, not everybody has to be president or a senator or a governor, right? There are thousands upon thousands of electoral offices. So where I tell people to start is usually think about what motivates you, what inspires you. Is it that, your high school had lead paint and, dilapidated surroundings? Is it that you live near, sort of a bus depot and you know that the air quality isn't the same? Or are you from an area where the water quality isn't the same? Is it noise pollution? Is it just sort of you've had the same elected official for 40 something years and you recognize that he or she is literally cashing a check and doing nothing for you? So like, think about what's the motivating factor. And I would say sort of work in that sector and work towards that. And I think the opportunity sort of germinates from that. But then also recognizing it's like, okay, so if elected office isn't your thing, a lot of students of mine are just like, oh, I'm going to go into banking or finance. And it's like, okay, somebody's got to finance this revolution. If that's what makes your heart sing and you like corporate law, that's okay. But recognize that there are social justice organizations that need that check. So there is a role for everyone to play. No matter what you decide to do, you can still play a part. Some people, it's just going to be the check writing phase. Other people, it's going to be, you have a dynamic personality. You're going to galvanize folks to be in these streets marching post-COVID or sort of in a safe social distance way. And some of you are going to run for office yourselves. But like, no matter what it is, it's like you have some sort of characteristic and quality that can move this conversation forward, that can move democracy forward. And it's just, you sort of should think about it seriously, right? And sort of spend some time really thinking about, like, why am I here? Why have I been afforded various privileges? Like, not everyone is coming from the same point, but, for the Oliver Scholars, this is a privileged position to be in. And so why me, right? And so what can I do with sort of all that has been poured in me? How can I then pour it into something else?
Thank you. Dinorah?
I think she said it all, right? It's this notion of self, us, now, right? Like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? And then young people are really good at this naturally. And the Oliver Scholars community is a great place for this. Build your coalition of people, right? It doesn't only have to be about the you on your own moving that rock up, right? Like, maybe you're going to be the front goose, right? Or maybe you're going to be in the formation. To the example that Chrissy gave from Reverend Sharpton, like, think about that moment in time for yourself and like what's motivating you to do the things, but do something, right? I think the biggest challenge often is that young people find that they have to be doing the meta thing or they can do nothing. There's a lot in between, right? Like, democracy is a spectrum of activity. So protesting in the street may not be for you. Again, you can resource the movement. You can be the person who's writing the policy for the movement. You could be the person writing the op-eds for the movement. You could be the person organizing the people at the movement. But there is a role for everybody. And so it's like, what are your skills, your competencies, what are your passions? And then finding your tribe to do that work, right? The Oliver Scholars resource group and alumni network is a great place to start, but there are also plenty of others. And I think that's what we forget is like, this all doesn't have to be built from scratch, right? You don't have to build some new thing again, build on what's already existing. You don't have to be the person always with the unique or great idea, though I suspect many of the scholars have them. Figure out where you can take that idea and scale it, right? How do you then transform society into what you want it to be by getting in, coalition with others, but really just get involved, right? Like, I love the passion, the energy, the vigor, and I want that to continue, right? Like, it's got to be this full contact sport that is regenerative, like that we're all doing it. Again, it doesn't have to be all day, every day, but you got to be in it. It can't be that you're like, oh, but I can't, the democracy. Wait, then why are people protesting, right? Like, you can't be mad about the January 6th if you weren't about helping to help grow our democracy and get rid of the racism that exists in America. And so we just have to think about using all of our tools in the toolbox to get there, and then knowing when the self-care is going to be key to take a break and reset.
So I know I probably should have asked this question earlier, but I wanted to talk a little bit before we end about police accountability. I watched a story today about a young man who was stopped by the police because he was walking in the snow. Hey, Merle, McGee, what policies around police accountability, like qualified immunity and defund the police, could be taken up by this administration?
You want me to take that?
Go for it.
And I see Merle, like, listen, Color of Change is doing great stuff with the media, that's for sure, but they can't do it all. And they're sort of one organization that's doing a lot. But as far as police accountability, I still think that Joe Biden, God bless him, but he's 78. So there's certain things that he just doesn't understand. And I think that he needs to surround himself with more people who understand the intricacies of sort of the policing conversation. So yes, there is a faction that believes in defunding the police. Some people argue that, we should just rebrand it because it's like, well, we're just reallocating funds to other sectors, whether it's education or mental health services or whatever it may be, and that would help other people. I think that a robust conversation within his administration is most likely happening, but he needs to understand how to stay on message and articulate a larger conversation, because when he has tried to talk about it, he deviates and, we start talking about biracial marriage or whatever it may be. And it's like, hey, I need you to focus, because this actually isn't something that's just affecting Black communities. This is something that's affecting a lot of communities in various ways. And I need him to be able to articulate how that puzzle fits together, not just in urban centers, not just in sort of like the top 10 cities, but we know that because Black people are getting pushed out of cities, now it's one cities again, we're in the ring 1 and ring 2 suburbs. And so policing in the suburbs and accountability in the suburbs looks very different. We know that in Minnesota, all those police officers who killed George Floyd had gone through the master's program and had done the extra courses on how to be a better police officer. So it's not just about retraining. Black folks know all this stuff. So what exactly are we doing? Because as my grandmother says, if we can put a man on the moon, we can sure as hell figure this out. So why is it that we can't seem to figure out policing when we can figure out every other thing quick, fast, if we need to? And so I think that he needs to have folks on the table, not opportunists, not people who are going to tell him what he needs to hear, but someone who's really going to lay out the sociological, the criminology map, the political maps, the sort of, the gentrification maps, the immigration maps, and how it links to ICE, all of it, so that he understands it. Because I think far too many electeds, not just Republicans, Democrats as well, when we start talking about poverty, they switch to blackness. When we start talking about criminality, they switch to blackness. When we talk about blackness, they switch to criminality or poverty. It's like, okay, so we need to, on the one hand, help you understand that, yes, we're disproportionately affected. But on the other hand, when you think about Black people, you shouldn't be thinking about pawn shops and prisons. You should be thinking about how these are equal members of a society and they deserve all the benefits that your granddaughters get when they walk down the street. So think about Black people as your granddaughter. And I think far too many elected officials mean well, but they can't do that. So there's still this sort of old ethos of what Blackness really is, which gets to the crux of the question, can we ever be full citizens, right? And how do we fight to sort of make that happen in the ballot booth and also in the streets? And to answer Monique's question, I don't think that Kamala Harris is there to educate Biden about policing, because honestly, when Biden was all about the crime bill in '94 that everyone likes to harp on, guess who was also all about it? Every single Black mayor and every single Black member of the CBC. That's where we were as a country, and the crime bill was the thing that everybody wanted. That's very different. He evolved into where he is now, which lots of Democrats are thankful for. Kamala Harris has a different sort of barrier in the sense that some of her crime bill-esque rhetoric was from 8 to 10 years ago, not 30 years ago. And so it makes her much harder to educate Biden. I think, honestly, the conversation that many activists would say is it goes from Biden to Harris, not Harris to Biden.
If you could write a 28th Amendment, what would you focus on?
I've been thinking about this question all day because I'm like, I don't know what the 28th Amendment's going to be on, but I really want to get rid of the Electoral College. So that's what I'm focusing the energy on, is like, actually, if we're going to come into power and really think about the power that is in the popular vote, right? Like, and what that means for Blackness and Black communities, that's what I want to focus on. I didn't have an explicit answer on that one, but I bet Chrissy does.
I didn't see that one. So there we are. I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I'm highly controversial in the sense that I'm actually not a proponent of getting rid of the Electoral College right now. I still think it's like, yeah, we've had 2 big elections, in recent memory where the popular vote did not match the Electoral College vote. 2000 was stolen. I mean, my sister were governor of Florida and I was running for president. Obviously, she'd do everything in her power to help me win. So Al Gore won. I don't consider that as a mismatch. That was just the Bushes being the Bushes. So 2016 was real, but I don't really count 2000. So it's like, until we get a real pattern going, I see the sort of inequities. I get it, but I do like having indirect government for certain things and direct government for others. I think it's antiquated, sure. And I think that it's worth being on the table to discuss, but I'm not willing to chop it. I do think, I don't know if it's the 28th Amendment, but I do think that there needs to be a cabinet position of some sort of civil rights, real civil rights, not some put it at the cute table and let's not do anything. I mean, a real cabinet position to talk about how do we undo not the past 4 years, but the past 400, and really think about it. And so if reparations falls under that conversation, sure. But I'm not about giving Black people checks that then they have to pay taxes on that goes to white business. What kind of reparations is that? That's just making white people money. So if we have a civil rights cabinet position, it's what does real reparations look like that would actually benefit Black people? Because if we do the other way, which is cut a check, you pay taxes, and then give it to white businesses, and then I said I don't even have to say I'm sorry. It's and now I owe you nothing. Then that doesn't work because we've changed nothing of the institutional structures. We just made people more racist because it's now we gave you Negroes money, and look, you still can't do anything with it. So it's but you didn't give us money because we actually gave the money right back to you. So we're not even. So I'd much rather think about the bureaucracy surrounding a president who can make decisions. I'm not exactly sure what a 28th Amendment was. Had I read that full email, then I probably would have some thought. Hey, it's a global pandemic, so I get a pass.
It's a pandemic. What are your thoughts on getting the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed? What are some tactics that we as voters can engage in, and what should we push our representatives to support?
I think we touched on this a little bit earlier. I would just reiterate that I think we need to have, the census has given us a bunch of good data, and hopefully it's not all stale, right, with people having moved around, and hopefully people are going to go back to wherever they filled out that census so that allocation of resources is equitable to communities that actually need it. But the Supreme Court was clear, right? They said we need evidence of the impact of taking away the Voting Rights Act on restricting access to voting. We need evidence of that, and so Congress needs to do its due diligence. It needs to actually have the hearings, create the record to substantiate passing the Voting Rights Act. It's not that Congress couldn't do it. I think, in this moment, as to Chrissy's point, the clock is running. They need to get some wins across the field. I think they can get the votes to get it done. It's about, will the court uphold what they did? And so we actually need to respect that the decision was very clear about the evidence that needs to be substantiated. And so all of us need to be pushing for Congress to have those hearings and to make sure that they're doing their diligence to gather the evidence to substantiate the need for the new Voting Rights Act.
So I'm going to ask the last question. Why are you doing this work? How did you get into this? How did you end up here?
How did I end up here? My story.
I know some of the kids may be wondering.
Yeah, no, I'm going to tell my honest version of my story. I ended up here because I was a young pregnant teen that people said, you can't do X, right? Like, you're not going to be high achieving, you're not going to succeed because you made a choice as a 16-year-old to get pregnant and to have a child, right? And for me, my entire life and my career's work has been about making democracy more accessible, getting rid of those barriers and making sure we demystify democracy for all people. It has not been in one specific lane the entire time, but for me, it was about making sure that I was able to advocate for myself and launch my own first advocacy campaign as a unknowing 17-year-old to make sure that I could graduate from my high school and stay with my peers and go on to college and law school. I do this work because I think not enough people tell, especially Black young people, that they can achieve regardless of what obstacles are in their way, right? If I were quoting the former New York State Assembly member, Michael Blake, he'd say, your zip code does not define your destiny. And so we all need to be thinking about what opportunity exists for us and what tools in our toolbox are we all going to use to make sure that we can achieve. And so I do the work that I do of demystifying democracy because I think that is core to any upward social mobility for our communities. If you don't understand how democracy works and how you can leverage it for the issues you care about, we're all going to end up in the same place we are in right now.
And I'm an educator. I come from a long line of educators, and I tell people all the time, it's like, I love cities and Black people. Pretty basic. So Black people live in cities by and large, and everything I do is to try and sort of take the information and the privilege that I've been given and give it to a wider audience, primarily of Black people when I can, recognizing that not everyone has been able to go to college or even go to grad school and spend time thinking about these ideas. And so I don't want to have sort of navel-gazing conversations with other academics. I actually want to have broad conversations with people to help them connect the dots and have sort of robust conversations and debates about what's best for Black people so we can figure that out.
Well, I just want to say that I feel so incredibly fortunate to have crossed paths with both of you. We don't see each other that often, but every time we see each other, it feels like family. And this is a tremendous gift in the midst of all of this thing. We understand that our kids don't always have access to the kitchen table conversations that may be available in some other communities. And so your willingness to share your wisdom and your knowledge and your solutions actually is much appreciated by me and everyone at Oliver Scholars. And thanks to everybody who watched us on Facebook Live.
Thank you, Danielle. Great to see both of you.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here and to see you all when I can't see you in person.
Yes.
Soon.
Tonight's episode is dedicated to media legend and community pillar William Cody Anderson.